So at this point you would see what still the European Union and the Western society can do. And do you think, at this we see the sanctions, but do you think at this point they can be effective in a short term?
Well, sanctions policy in general is a diplomatic political tool that has a mixed record. What effect do sanctions have with Cuba, Iran? You can pick different places. I think the importance of the sanctions is that politically they're showing, one, that the European Union is united. You cannot have a sanction in Europe without unanimity. They're showing that politically there is a rejection of what Russia is doing. It's important to do something. They are showing that each time that there has been an escalation by Mr. Putin, that there have been more sanctions. So they're sending a signal that you escalate, there is an associated, through sanctions, an associated cost each time. And sanctions being on the table give you something, if there's proper negotiations in the end, that you can take off the table. What do you have on the table if you have no sanctions and if you're not a direct participant in an actual war? So I think for these reasons they're important to have. But I would not exaggerate their effect. Have they contained Mr. Putin? I don't know. They certainly have not stopped him from annexing Crimea. They've not stopped him from the interference we see in Donbass. And at that level, sanctions, of course, have very limited effect. But I do think there are other good reasons of the sort I've described to have sanctions. What do I think? I think it's good to see through the Minsk Protocol an attempt to stop the fighting. There cannot be, in the end, a military win in this situation, and the price of the fighting is devastating to do with the hundreds of thousands of displaced persons, has created a clear humanitarian problem. And as long as people are shooting at each other, even opening up the corridors to supply the necessary humanitarian aid becomes difficult.
But what to say that, especially now this Minsk negotiation, that those people, representing all this so-called DNR, LNR, are not really representing the Donbas people, and how to deal, because there are the others, and there is sometimes, enforced negotiations are more or less enforced. What to do if the people don't trust to this partner? There is no real trust.
Look, the people who sit at the table from Donbass are at the table not by the force of reason, not by the force of law, but by the force of arms. And nobody ever made a democratic society from the barrel of a gun. And so they are at the table only by force of arms. But the worst thing now, just now, has been the fighting and its displacement effect. So I think as a first step, not because they are democratically legitimate, they have no legitimacy, but they are there by force of arms. They are there clearly as proxies of Russia. Where did they get the arms? Where did they get the capacity to do what they've done? I think better to have dialogue. Mr. Churchill had a phrase, jaw is better than war. And why? Because what is the alternative? To go to an all-out conventional military conflict, what would be the effect in terms of devastation, loss of life, and ultimately, what is the end of it? How do you settle that conflict? You still need some table to negotiate at between enemies.
But how is it possible to negotiate with the proxies?
It's very difficult because Mr. Putin, with increasingly implausible deniability, I've used a phrase in something I've written, he is hiding in full public view. In other words, we all know what's happening, we all know who is manipulating it, but it's all done in a way through shadows, through proxies, to try to pretend or to deny fundamental responsibility. This is the real difficulty. Why is this happening? Mr. Putin has torn up the rule book of the post-Second World War order by deciding that he had a right to do with Russian ethnics in Crimea, to annex Crimea, that he has given himself the right to interfere with and breach the territorial integrity of Donbass. And there is, as you talk about negotiations, normally you negotiate within a set of principles. These principles have been torn up, so it's extremely difficult.
What do you think we talk about the sanction, and in this we know that Europe now is more united in that way, probably more awakened and aware with whom it's talking, but what else at this point could be done? I mean, if not, we understand there won't be like lethal weapon, boots on the ground, and this military option is out of question.
There won't be that, I think, for a whole variety of reasons. One of them, I think, is a fundamental belief. And I mean, if you're going to start a war and get involved in it, you always have to think, what is your exit strategy? What is the end of it? And this was, for example, not very well thought by the Americans when they went into Iraq, and we see the consequences. There is no appetite to engage Russia right beside its own territory in a conventional military engagement. And so I think that option, you may find lots of words about solidarity and talk at NATO summits. I frankly don't see, coming from all those words, any specific or concrete military action at all. So the issue, I think, that Europe and the United States and others need to focus on is to encourage this very fragile peace process and to mobilize a level of resources for the rebuilding of Ukraine, and I don't just mean the infrastructure but economy and so on, that Ukraine so badly needs and that is being postponed because of the war.
And in general, like being Irish, you know, like not Northern Irish but Irish still, what are the main challenges and the lessons for the societies which went to the conflict, a long conflict, and trying to get out of this? What are the main concern at this point?
Well, if you can establish the peace process in a sustainable way, the good thing in that is that the killing stops. And in this sense, peace as not being at war is a good thing. But the much more difficult thing to do with a peace process is to have peace with reconciliation. All of the people who feel hurt, who've been physically or psychologically injured, who have been displaced, who've lost trust in Russia or Ukraine or wherever their trust may have been. You cannot assume this. This is another exercise that if you stop the hot war, the shooting war, your next big duty is to engage in the process of reconciliation. And I would certainly hope that after the elections, when there's a new parliament, a new government with a new legitimacy, that one of the very high priorities is this understanding that peace also requires a process of reconciliation, and this is not done overnight. I'd say in Northern Ireland, 20 years after the first peace agreement was agreed, and then 16 years after it was finalised, that the reconciliation agenda is one that we still struggle with.
And what are the main issues still to cope? Why it takes so long? What is the hardest? Well,
a lot of it is the hurt about the killings and injuries that went on, the fact that amnesties were negotiated as part of the peace process, the fact that the dead are dead forever, but the people with the amnesty are walking free, and then someone sees them in the street. All these things are very real things on the street, in the society, and they are part of a peace process, but they are things that people find difficult to reconcile to. Another thing in Northern Ireland that captures difference is symbols. They changed the police force in Northern Ireland to a new police force, and then they changed the badge on the hat of the policeman. And many of the widows of murdered policemen were profoundly upset that this was an additional killing of the memory of their dead. And so symbols are there. They have a symbolic reason, a symbolic purpose, but they represent much more than a badge. In Northern Ireland there are still big divisions about flags. Which flag can fly how often on the City Hall of Belfast has caused riots in Belfast.
But with the amnesty, there are two issues we're curious, like about what are the principles for the amnesty? Who are the people who would be excused?
Well, in the case of Northern Ireland, one of the issues about the amnesty was that there was an agreement which was made on the side of the peace deal and approved at prime ministerial level by the state, at the time I think by Prime Minister Blair. This became publicly known only many years later, and so there was a big argument why it wasn't publicly known before, and there was a big argument what it meant, about killers being free and so on, and whether people would ever be charged with murder if new evidence came forward. So the sensitivities around these issues, I hear the words being used today about amnesty law and so on. These are part of the toolkit of a peace process, but they leave other wounds behind. So if you were living in Slavyansk and you see someone who has just killed members of your family, now with the amnesty, living on the same street, this is where the reconciliation challenge becomes very powerful, because your family are dead and you're looking at their killer free, and the emotions around this is what I'm talking about. Not that it shouldn't happen. You have to get out of the war, you have to try to struggle to find a peace process, but the dynamics of this require very careful and sensitive management.
And how about what are the main challenges of disarmament of the paramilitary?
Again, if I can use the Irish analogy, this was a very big issue that the paramilitaries had to disarm, but it didn't come quickly. There were lots of arguments over it and lots of delays, but what we did was we appointed a Canadian general, General de Chastelain, and two very respected churchmen, one from the Catholic faith and one from the Protestant faith, which would have been the two religions that also separated in Northern Ireland in terms of identity. And these three, the general and the two religious, would attend decommissioning events unseen by the public, but would then give their witness and their report that we witnessed the destruction of the following kinds of weapons. And at the very end, one camera crew was permitted to come and attend the very last of these decommissionings and show photographs not of the persons but of the process. To put the weapons beyond use was the phrase, to destroy the weapons. So the method that was used in Northern Ireland was to find a team of people who were not political, who were not part of the campaign of terror, who were trusted as reliable witnesses, and who were trusted by all sides as reliable witnesses, to let them do that work.
How is it possible to persuade the people with the arms that they would feel secure without them?
Well,
and that their arms won't be needed anymore?
Well, now here is exactly the whole issue about reconciliation and trust. And it's why I started with the observation, peace is much more complicated than just not fighting. The not fighting is the first part of peace. And I'm not saying it's easy, it's very fragile, but it is the easiest part compared to the rebuilding of trust, mutual respect, and the willingness to accept that the rule of law is your only guarantee. And that is a journey that you can't take for granted.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.